Hi, today we are going to learn how to develop CRUD application using ASP.NET MVC Core Web API and ReactJS. This session is divided in two parts. The first part is where we are going to talk about how do we work with web APIs, in which we are going to see how to create an ASP.NET MVC Core 3.1 web API based on Entity Framework. How do we create Open API documentation or Open API specification for this API by using open source and other tools like Swagger. Followed by how do we test this API into the browser with the help of Swagger UI. In the second part of this session, we're going to see how to consume this web API using ReactJS for the client-side development. Here we are going to understand how to set up ReactJS development environment in Visual Studio, followed by implementing the backend communication service to communicate with the web API, followed by how do we implement the CRUD UI in our application, followed by the actual communication happening with the backend web API, and finally how do we test the front-end application. So let's talk a bit about the background of the web APIs, how web APIs came into existence. It all starts with the client-server communication requirement for any application, because if you are talking about the applications being used at the enterprise level, we want multi-user application in most of those cases. So in late 90s, basically the need for the client-server based applications arose a lot. And that's where we had some technologies that allowed us to create the application in two different parts, where we used to go for using the specific terms like client and the server. So one app used to be something that served the UI to the client, what we used to call as client application, and then the backend application running somewhere on the network. That is what we used to call as server application. So when it comes to the client server application, there are different features, different tools, different technologies available on different platforms. Precisely talking about the .NET framework, .NET framework started with the support natively there for the socket programming, which is the base of all client server stuff. And then they provided some high level wrappers also on the top of the socket programming. So we had three different implementations right from the beginning within .NET framework for client server applications for addressing different needs, different scenarios. We had .NET Remoting, which was a typical client server framework, and that basically allowed one server, many clients kind of implementation, mostly on the enterprise domain network, or we can say the intranet. Now, when we talk about the big enterprise networks, we may have multi-domain environment as well. And to have the client server application running over there for multi-server, multi-domain environments, and again, location specific implementation might be required as well in such cases. .NET had the support for something called as enterprise services, which also used to be called as COM+. And then for communicating with non-.NET applications, we had another framework into .NET that was named as web services. So web services were basically the APIs that used to run on HTTP, and because them running on the HTTP, they were basically accessible to different heterogeneous platforms and different heterogeneous technologies. As the communication was not actually the way how socket programming works, or how the remoting or does the communication, or the enterprise services does the communication, where basically there is something called as remote calls which basically get exchanged. With web services, it was more of a HTTP request response model which was focused on, and within this request response we used to have the data being exchanged with the help of some serializers. Mostly XML was the base for that. And hence these web services used to be also called as XML web services. And this XML had a predefined schema associated with it, that is so.
simple object access protocol, which was supposed to be common across all technologies, all platforms. And that made the communication between heterogeneous technologies and platforms possible. But then we, if we see how the SOAP messages get constructed, how the services are exposed to the clients with the help of another XML schema called as WSDL or WSDL is what we pronounce it. If you see the structure, if you see the size of that document that gets serialized is quite huge because it contains lots of metadata information also about what data you are exchanging from client to server or server to client. And that's where integration with some older platforms, older technologies, or maybe with the platform where we have the mobile applications that are supposed to be integrated, we face the challenges there because these devices, mobile devices or tabs, or if you talk about kiosks, we have limited amount of resources in terms of memory, in terms of CPU, in terms of storage. And that's where integrating the service, which is representing bulk information, becomes challenging. Though the devices have evolved a lot and they have become very, very powerful and they have lots of resources available as on today, but still they are pretty much behind the complete computer system that we generally use, right? So we talk about the standard configuration for the laptop with 16 GB of RAM and say 1 terabyte of storage and probably the processor like i3, i5, i7 from Intel. Then there are other vendors also like AMD, which come up with very powerful processors. These features cannot be compared with what your mobility devices basically are going to bring along. Because those devices are small, those devices are handheld, they have their own limitations in terms of supporting the resources, right? They will always lag behind as compared to that of a complete computer system. And that is where we required some kind of platform change or architecture change, where the amount of information that gets exchanged can be restricted to the actual data rather than also providing the metadata of that information. I mean, some kind of compression also can be planned over there and some format that can be used over here, which is schema-less. And even if it is having schema, it is the bare minimum schema that is shared. Okay, so that is where the RESTful pattern came in, which is again the implementation of web services, which is not based on SOAP, but based on plain text messages, where again the format for the plain text could be JSON or XML. And precisely JSON is more compact. That's why RESTful services more often focus more on the JSON format. But again, it depends on the client's requirements. So ideally, the frameworks that you use to build your RESTful services must have support for having the serialization done for JSON or XML as per the client's need. And that is where Microsoft brought in their own framework for building RESTful services pretty quickly and easily without getting into the details of what RESTful pattern is. And that's what they named as ASP.NET MVC Web APIs, or in short, just Web APIs. Now, why MVC comes into picture? Because the model that is used for programming the APIs is based on the MVC model, where the view component is not actually built, but you have model and controllers where your API itself represents the controller. And the view then can be implemented as per the need by the third parties or maybe some other teams within your organization, where the view can be a web view, it can be a mobile view, it can be a native application view, depending on the kind of application which is eventually required at the client end, right? So view is there, but not as the part of the API, but it's a third-party application that needs to be created then later on based on the need. So that's what basically the background for the Web API is. And when Microsoft came up with .NET Core, the open source cross-platform implementation of .NET framework, they retained ASP.NET platform into it by the name ASP.NET Core. MVC became available as well, ASP.NET Core MVC or MVC Core is what we call it. and then eventually web APIs were also the part of it. Right, so that's the platform that we are going to use over here to build our web API. And this web API, I want to be data driven. So I want this API to be connected to my local SQL Server instance. Just by changing the connection string, actually, you can change connectivity to your network server or maybe to some cloud-based server also, like SQL Azure also can be connected. So for this demo, I'm going to use the local server. And entity framework is the framework that I will be using, entity framework core precisely, that I will be using to make communication with the database and perform the queries. Right, so let's start. Here I go to Visual Studio 2019 and straight away take a new project. With the help of these filters drop-downs, I will be making sure that I get into the web programming templates. So the language that I'm going to use for the server-side programming is C#. Hence I select C# here. I want this application to be cross-platform, so all platforms is what I choose here. And then ultimately, I want a web application to be created, so I select web here. In that list, which then appears here, it by default shows me the first template by the name ASP.NET Core Web Application. This is what I'll be selecting, where it confirms that it's cloud ready. C# is the backend language and can be deployed on Windows, Linux, Mac OS, precisely any platform. And we can create a service also into it, and any web-driven application can be created into it. So great, I just click on next. Here I need to give the name to this project. So I call this as DNC.NET Core _ demo web API and React, as the same project is going to have the implementation for both the web API and the React implementation. Though I can create these two things as two different applications as well. But to keep it simple as of now, I'm just going with the same application hosting both, so that we don't get into the cross origin or sharing issue as well. If we get into that, we need to actually enable the CORS policy, which will then allow the communication between two different domains. So to avoid that, I'm as of now going to use the same project. So here I select the location to my desktop and click on create. Now we are presented with some of the templates, out of which we need to select one for creating our ASP.NET Core application. We have some templates starting with empty that will not create anything as a sample for me. It will be just a project with a configuration into it, initial setup into it, which I then need to configure explicitly as per the name. Then we have a template named as web application. So this will basically create a sample web application based on ASP.NET platform without using MVC, but the page content will be Razor page content, something similar to what MVC views basically represent. Web application model view controller. So again, the sample web application gets created based on MVC templates. You will have controllers, you will have some models, you will have some views generated for the sample, and then you have the API template, which is same as this web application. The only difference being you will have a sample web API also created for you. And then you have template for Angular and React. So if you are looking to create the application that has got some web APIs built into it, and the front end is going to be driven entirely by HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and to make it better and simpler implementation, if I'm looking to use some kind of framework, I will go for Angular or React. I have two choices over here where I can select that framework that needs to be used on the client side to provide me the single page application implementation. So here our choice is going to be ReactJS, because The second part of this application is all about ReactJS application consuming the web API that we built. Now, one thing is common in between these two. The backend is by default going to be web API. So there will be a sample web API generated in both of these cases. And there will be some sample content also generated based on React framework that communicates with the sample web API. So let's select this React.js and click on create. And here the application is ready. I just need to close this welcome page. We can see the folder structure that we have got over here. We have got this sample web API under controllers by the name weather forecast controller. The model class is represented by this weather forecast. Let me open this. So this is my model class. It has got 4 properties: date, of date time type, temperature C integer, temperature F integer, where temperature C is temperature in Celsius and temperature F is temperature in Fahrenheit. And then we have summary representing what type of day it is based on the temperature information. Okay, so this is going to be the model, and then we have our sample API created over here. Simple class weather forecast controller that inherits from controller base, marked as API controller that makes it a web API. We have some payload over here that will be used as the value for summary based on the temperature generated. And then here goes the constructor that sets up the logger, and then only one sample method we have here that will be called whenever the HTTP GET request comes to this web API. And here we have some logic which is generating the weather forecast for next 5 days. So right now it's more of a random information getting generated. We can actually connect this to some AI or machine learning algorithm, which will take in some samples from the previous days, and based on that, it will forecast the data. Right. So just to keep it simple and just a demo application, here it is. So they have created the entire forecast information based on some random logic and returning the list of the different temperatures over here. Okay, so this is sample API, nothing much to do with this. Will not be using this web API at all. And let me close both of these files. Then we have program.cs, which is the entry point for our application, typical .NET Core stuff, where we are using the create host builder helper method to create the instance of the host and read the configuration from configuration file and probably console based arguments, and then ultimately create the instance of the host application, which sets up the endpoints where the request can go. And it uses the startup class, which is over here. So we have the startup class where the constructor goes in, sets up the configuration API, which is of type I configuration. And then we have 2 important methods. One is configure services, the other is configure, where configure services is basically providing an IOC container where I can register all of my dependency services. Couple of services being already registered. That is add controllers with views, so that is specific to the MVC framework. And then we have the support for static files being added. So that's also injected already. And then we have the configure method, which is used to set up our request pipeline with the various middleware components that are required to make my application work smoothly. So conditionally, I'm setting up the exception handler. If I'm running the application in development environment, I am interested in looking at the developer exception page, that typical yellow screen of death, where I can actually troubleshoot the issue. And if I'm not in development environment, in that case, I want the user-defined exception handler to be used. So it's there defined in controller named as error. And then we have HTTPS redirection, which is a typical web standard these days, while working with the enterprise applications. Mostly this is what we need. Even if the request to our application comes on HTTP channel, we want it to be redirected by default to HTTPS, and that's what this middleware does. And then we activate the static files middleware so that the static files can also be served, where the static files could be the HTML files, the CSS files, the JavaScript files, images, audio, video components, whatever you are using into your application. As we are going to use React framework, React is a JavaScript framework, and hence some integration with the static files will be needed. Also, for the designing purpose, we are going to use Bootstrap, which is by default configured for this project. And then again, specifically for the React, we have another middleware being loaded here, that is parse static files. Then we have the MVC specific feature that is enabling the routing middleware so that route engine comes in. And then to configure the endpoints, we have use endpoints middleware that actually creates the routes for us. And then ultimately the middleware for the SPA, the React handling basically is configured here, where you can see the source path has been set to client app folder, and under development environment, it will be also making use of the React development server to serve the React content or the client side content. Now that is what we have here on the server side. Then we can see there is a folder called as client app. This client app folder represents the entire client side stuff, including your content that needs to be shared with the client in the form of HTML pages, in the form of JavaScript, CSS, whatever that you are going to serve, including the React framework as well. So we have client app, which has got public folder into it. So we have the home page over there, index.html, some configuration in manifest.json, then source, which contains all the implementation with JavaScript based on React. So React deals a lot with something called as components, which are actually reusable components that can contain some code, that can contain some UI generation logic and all, which goes over here as components. There is some CSS also coming into it, which is going to be precisely used by this file, navmenu.js and navmenu.css. By name, you can see these are related, where what are the navigation menu that is going to be generated, the designing part of that will be taken care of by the CSS. Then the application level global CSS is there, custom CSS. This anyways is the extension to Bootstrap. Main CSS is going to be served by the Bootstrap only. Then you have app.js, index.js. Index.js is basically connected to that index.html, which loads the home page. App.js contains all of your React specific entry point configuration, routes and all, whatever you will be configuring for the client side will go into this. And then there is a dependency service, which basically makes your React server available, that is registered service worker. And then we have package.json that contains the npm packages information, just like our packages.config in .NET framework used to contain information about the NuGet packages that application uses. Here, all that information now has been moved into the project file itself. Right, but npm has got its own dependency on package.json. Whichever npm packages you install, all the information goes into this. From here also, you can install or uninstall any of the packages that are required or not required. Okay, so let's not get into this part as of now, because most of the dependencies from Node and npm have been already set for us. We just need to test that this template has created the right things for me. So I just go and press Control F5 key combination on my keyboard. It will build the project. It will download all the dependencies from NuGet that are for server side stuff and npm for client side stuff. So it may take a while to restore all the dependencies, and then our application will get launched. So here comes the browser. first time it needs to download too many npm packages. That's where it takes time. But once it is loaded, it becomes quite fast. Okay, so this is loaded here. That's our home page. There are 3 menu items also. Okay, some sample implementation where there is no communication with the backend service. Then for that weather forecast service, we have got some UI represented by this fetch data stuff. And once I click on this, here the weather forecast gets displayed based on that random weather forecast generation. So that's what we have by default. And by looking at this, we can say that our template has been established properly without any issues. All npm packages have been installed properly. NuGet packages have been installed properly, and our application is in good shape. Just close this browser and get back into the application. Now I want one web API to be created of my own that talks to SQL Server database and provides me the complete CRUD operations on it: create, retrieve, update, delete. So let's go ahead and open Solution Explorer. The first thing I'm going to do is in app settings.json, I'm going to create a section named as connection strings to hold the connection string to connect to the SQL Server. So connection strings, which is going to be another JSON object. So I put curly braces pair followed by comma. And here I need to give some key to that connection string so that programmatically I can retrieve the connection string from here. Let's say this is called as test db.cs. That is the connection string for testdb that we will be using, colon, the real connection string. So typical SQL Server connection string I'm going to use here. Server equals to local db / ms sql local db. That is by default service installed along with Visual Studio. If you have put the data tools also into the workload of Visual Studio installer. Then goes the database name. So let's say database is equals to testdb. In fact, I can use one of my existing database over here. I'll just show you. I have a simple database created named as company DB, within which I already have a table named as department with just 3 fields into it. So I go to Server Explorer, data connections. I hope the connection to company DB already is there. So I just expand this tables, and here I have departments table. Let me show the table data. So I have 3 columns over here: department number, dname, and location. Where department number is integer, dname is envarchar 50, location is envarchar 50, which we can confirm from here. So department number, I press F4 to open the properties, and here it shows me the data type as int. I'll just keep it pinned for a while. And then I select dname. You can see envarchar and 50 is the size. Same thing goes for location, envarchar and 50 is the size. Let's unpin this, and that's my database already present. Okay. Let's connect to this database itself. Hence, I name this database as company DB, and I want to use the Windows integrated security. So I just say integrated security equals to true. Save this. I'll need this name somewhere. Then the next thing I'm going to do is create a folder in the project named as models. In that, I right click and say add class named as department DPT. Import couple of namespaces over here. First one is system dot component model dot data annotations. Second one is system dot component model dot data annotations dot schema. Here I have to put an attribute on the class named as table. Then here I pass the name for the table. Basically, this is where I need to tell the system that which table I'm going to map to. So here I go with departments. This is all entity framework stuff where I'm mapping this entity to this model, right? Entity framework is all about object relational mapping. So this is my object and this is the relational data and this is where I'm doing the mapping. Then I have some properties over here. First is int department number. Second is string dname. Third is string location. I want this to be treated as primary key, which in database it is already primary key. So I just want to make sure that at the application level also it gives me the same behavior. And I want this to be mandatory also, so I make it required. Then for dname, I want this to be max length 50 because in database the maximum length allowed is 50 characters. And same thing goes for location as well. Max length 50. So my model class is ready. Next thing I do here is add another folder to the project named as DAL for data access layer. Let's right click this, add a new class. Let's name this as company DB context. Import the model's namespace here. And now before we proceed forward, we'll use this package manager console to install package that provides me connections and all the operations with the SQL Server backend. So here I go and say install package Microsoft.entity framework .SQL Server. This will by default install entity framework core also, and the SQL Server, this precise package basically installs the entity framework core provider for SQL Server. So with one single command itself, I can have multiple other packages also installed. Such packages are also called as meta packages. You can see multiple packages being installed here. And done. The next thing that I do here is I import the namespace Microsoft.entity framework core, which gives me a base class over here to make my class inherit from. that is DB context. And then here I define a property of type DB set to represent the collection of department objects by the name departments. If you have worked with entity framework in the past, this should be easy for you to understand. And then here I create my first constructor without parameters and chain it to my base class constructor. I create another constructor over here with parameters of type DB context options, and let's say this is named as options. Then chain this constructor also to the base class parameterized constructor where it is asking for DB context options. I just pass the same. Okay, so our DAL class is also ready. And after saving this, I go back to startup where I need to inject this DB context stuff into my services. So here we go and import a couple of namespaces. One is Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. The other one is the DAL in namespace. Okay, and then here I say services dot add DB context of type company DB context. The method, so parenthesis, asking for a parameter of type action, which is a delegate, and that delegate is taking in a parameter of type DB context options builder. I can use lambda expressions to set this. I say options is the parameter that goes in options dot use SQL Server, where I say that application DB context that I'm configuring here, that is company DB context, will communicate with SQL Server in the backend. And here for use SQL Server, I need to pass the connection string. I can pass hard-coded string, or I can take help from this configuration API as well. So I just say configuration dot get connection string, as we have already given our connection string in app settings. It's better to read from there. And then the connection string name I need to pass, which is basically the key that we have given in app settings.json. Test dbcs is what I'll pick from here, and in the startup.cs here in double quotes, I'll paste this. So this will add the support for SQL Server in backend. If you don't want SQL Server communication, you just want in-memory communication, temporary database to be created, you have another middleware component for that. That is use memory cache, right? So in that case, the physical server is not needed. In case if you don't have SQL Server, this will help you. So save this all and let's say build. Let's say build solution. And it says build is succeeded. Now the next thing I need to do is my controller class to be generated. Meanwhile, I can just close these all the tabs and no more going to need them. Here I go to Solution Explorer, select Controllers folder, right click and say Add, select Controller. And then here, out of these 6 templates, I'll go for API controller with actions using entity framework. That will automatically read the entire entity framework configuration and will build the web API having different operations for all the CRUD operations that I'm looking for. So let's select this and click Add. Asking for the model class, which is department in our case, I just select that. Data context class is company DB context. And then it is asking about the name for the controller. I prefer my APIs to have API controller as the suffix. So I just modify the name to departments API controller and click on Add. Done. So our API has been built. Under controllers folder, we can just have a quick look at that. All the using statements required automatically taken in. We have the department's API controller inheriting from controller base, already having API controller attribute, making it a web API, and the route template directly configured using the attribute based routing for the APIs, and which says that the route to this API starts with API slash and then followed by the controller name. We have company DB context object defined here, and via constructor based dependency injection, we are getting this initialized here. And then the operations, get departments, that returns high enumerable of department. So we are returning the list. Then get department having one parameter ID. Logic, if you see, is searching for a specific department by the given ID. If not found, this department will be null. And that's what we are doing a checking over here. If it is null, we are returning the HTTP status code not found, which makes it a typical RESTful service. Because one of the rule of the RESTful services say that no matter whether you have data or not, even if you have some exception, there has to be some HTTP status code returned back to the client. That way we can say the communication is all about typical HTTP standards based communication. Next method that we have is put department, which is for update operation that takes in the old ID, original ID, and then the updated department object. And as per the current industry standards, it checks that the old original ID and the new modified department number should be same. Usually the primary keys are not allowed to be modified these days. So that's why the check by default coming in. If it is not matching, straight away we return the bad request result. And what this returns is HTTP status code 400. So that is bad request. And if it is same, then we just say that, okay, take in the changes and modify it into the collection. So by saying context.entry of department.state equals to modified, it merges the changes into the collection. And the moment we say save changes, it gets synchronized with the database. In this case, we may face a DB concurrency exception where some other user might have already deleted this record, or the second case could be or might have already modified. So in that case, our update is not going to succeed and will fail with the concurrency exception. So that's where we are putting a check just to keep the user informed. If it is like the other user has deleted that record that we are looking to modify, return not found. So 404 status code will be returned. Otherwise, just throw the exception and let the user know that this data has been modified by someone else. So just refresh, reload the information and retry updates if required. Update operation doesn't return anything, so we are saying return no content. Then we have post department, which is for insert or create operation. So here we receive the data. And here we have added that into the collection and we are saving the changes for synchronizing with the database. And then we are returning the route where this record has got created. So if interested, we can actually consume this information. And then there goes the delete operation that takes an ID for the department to be deleted, finds that if it is not found, return not found. Otherwise, go ahead and remove it and say save changes so that the data from the database also gets removed. And department exist is basically the helper method being used in put department here. So that's our API successfully created. I'll just say Control F5 once again to see if this API is working for me or not. Here, after the base address, I put /API/departments API and press enter. And I get to see some data there. So that means my API is working. I can test only the get operations here. I pass a parameter for the ID, that is department number, and see it's giving me the result there as well in the JSON format. Let's close the browser. Now the next task is I want the open API standard space specification to be utilized over here so that I can share the information about my API with my prospective clients, where they can dirty their hands by looking at what this API contains, what all operations are there, what input it takes, what output it gives, all that information. Something similar to the ASMX or XML web services used to do with the help of the Wisdom documentation. So I want the same thing over here. And for that, the first thing we need to do is install another package over here. That is named as swashbuckle dot Asp Net Core. You can alternatively install nswag also. It's all about using the Swagger framework to generate open API spec, depending on what package you are comfortable with or which package is used by your organization. You can decide on one of them. Okay, so I installed this package. Yeah, the configuration that we are going to do now is going to depend on which package you have installed. Okay, so here we go to Solution Explorer and open startup.cs file and import namespace, that is swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core. .swagger. And then in configure services method, here I'll register one of the service which will actually be resulting in generating the Swagger documentation or the open API specification for me. So here we make use of this IOC container services, and there we say add Swagger gen. That stands for add Swagger generator. This will make sure my Swagger document or open API spec is generated when requested. Adding this dependency is not going to be just sufficient. We need to actually add a middleware that consumes this dependency and makes the Swagger documentation available to us. So here we go and go to configure method, and as the last statement I put app.use Swagger. And then I say control F5. So this will activate that dependency and will make sure the Swagger documentation is generated for me. So let's wait for the home page to be loaded. Okay, to view that open API spec, now I need to say after this base address, put slash swagger slash v1 slash swagger.json. This comes from the default configuration given by your dependency service. Okay, somehow it's not showing the document. Probably because of the React router which is in place for the client side. Let me take this URL and launch the Postman tool. Let's see if this gives me the specification. I close the existing tabs here, create a new one, and put the new request here, and click send. So we have okay, here also the React router is working. No problem. For now, we can just ignore this. Anyways, this is going to give me just a JSON document, and this may not be that useful for us because if I'm not expert in JSON, I may find it difficult to actually read and understand. So the next thing which I'll do, okay, one thing we can try though is instead of having app.useSwagger plays here, before use routing, I'll try to put it. Sometimes the placement, I mean the sequence of the placement also matters here, where one of the middleware overrides the other one. So let me try this once. That swagger slash v1 slash swagger.json once again. Yeah, so it worked. So this is the JSON documentation, open API spec documentation generated for our API, confirmed over here. The version being generated is 3.0.1, and all information like what all operations you have, what input they take, what output they give, the schema that is being used, everything mentioned here. You can see there is a section schemas in which I have schema for department, I have schema for weather forecast, both the model objects with their entire details coming in, right? So this is what needs to be shared with the client for them to be able to communicate with my service. And before communicating, before integrating within the application, they might want to have a look at what the service is doing, how the input goes, what kind of input goes, what is the output that comes back, and whether it is going to be useful to us or not. Okay, the next thing is I want little easier way where the user can understand what this documentation is and can actually create the test calls to that API to see whether it is serving their purpose or not. For that, I go for another middleware after use Swagger. I put use Swagger UI. Wherein it is taking an action delegate that depends on Swagger UI options. So I just say options goes in. Again, Lambda expression I'm going to use. Here goes the method body for this. I put it on multiple lines. Options dot Swagger endpoint, where I need to give couple of parameters. First is URL and second is name. URL is where that document is present. So relative URL I need to give. If you remember in the browser, after the base address, we put /swagger /v1 /swagger.json. This is the reference URL based on which the UI is going to be generated. and then the name, descriptive name for the service. Maybe I can call this as UI for Optimistic Infosystems APIs E1, and if this and Control F5 again. Here I now just need to put slash Swagger in place, not the complete path, and my Swagger UI should get generated. See how nicely it has put that. Based on that JSON documentation, it has detected there are two APIs in my application, Depths API and Weather Forecast API. Depths API contain all the CRUD operations, whereas Weather Forecast contains only GET operation. So if I want to test this API, okay, before that you can see the schema is also displayed here. Departments is one of the schema, Weather Forecast is another schema. And then if I want to test any of the API, I just need to go there and click on the respective button, get, post, put, delete, whatever it is. Let's say I want to test weather forecast first. It gives me more UI where I have a button titled as try it out. I just click on that and here I get the response. 200 success. Okay, I actually need to click on execute for that. That was just sample. And here now the actual command goes in. And here it shows me what request URL was there, status code, what I got after execution, the response body, what I've got, and response headers, what I've got, and that's it. So I can say cancel, I can say click again on this get button so that it collapses. Here now I can test my own API also. So let's say get, write out, execute. I should see all the existing data into my departments table here shortly. And there I get it. Okay. Similarly, I can test this get, where after clicking on try it out, the parameter text box gets enabled. I'm looking to search for department ID as 8. Click on execute. It shows me there is one. Next, I want to test the post one. Again, I click on try it out. By default, request body schema has been generated. I just change the values. Department number, I'll keep 0 because that is auto number. DNAME I give as marketing. And let's say the location is Mumbai. I click on execute. And there it is. The response code 201 says it is successful. The department number generated over here is 1008. Rename marketing, location Mumbai. I can once again use get over here where I'm looking for department ID 1008. Click on execute, I get that. I go to put, click on try it out. I'm looking to modify the record with 1008 as ID. Here I'll say this is also 1008. Department name I don't want to change, it is marketing. If I wish to change, I can put the modified value. And the location I want to change from Mumbai to Pune. Let's click on execute. Response code 204 says that it is successful. We collapse this. Again, go back to get. It has remembered that parameter value. I just say execute and here it says it's changed. Then I go for delete. Try it out. 1008. And execute. It's deleted. Let's collapse this and go back to this get method, search for this 1008, and I see it gives me 404 error, not found. So it's an important feature over here when it comes to the Open API specification. Instead of writing this Open API spec by hand, there are frameworks which are capable of generating that documentation for us. And the most popular framework is Swagger. Now, Swagger also is provided by multiple open source teams. So one is Swashbuckle. There is another called as NSwag. There are many more. You can choose as per your need, as per your comfort. And ultimate result is going to be something like this, where at the application level, the most important part is this documentation. You can see there is a link also generated here. I click on that and I directly get to that documentation. This is the most important thing at the application level, but to allow the users to see what your API has got to offer and dirty their hands with it, this UI also is very important. So that's where we have the couple of middlewares, just Swagger and then Swagger UI. Okay. Now, one more thing I'm looking for is when I run the project, to reach to the Swagger documentation, I have to say /Swagger explicitly. Then it goes there. What if I'm looking for the Swagger documentation to be given right at the root website address itself? For that, we'll say options dot route prefix equals to string dot empty. And let's say control F5. Usually if you have a project which contains only APIs and nothing else, there it is recommended to be used. If your application is a mix of APIs and the UI, then this route prefix should not be configured. You can set it to something else also. In that case, instead of /Swagger, what you have put to the route prefix will be used. You can see directly it's coming over here. Okay, I didn't do anything. Directly it reaches here. I just close this and comment this out because our project is not just an API only project. It is going to have some client-side stuff also with React features. So that is the end of our part 1. We have successfully created the ASP.NET MVC Core 3.1 Web API based on Entity Framework. We successfully added the Open API specification for this API using Swagger, and we successfully tested this API into the browser using the Swagger UI generated. Right, so now it's all about the second part where we want to consume this web API into the ReactJS implementation. I want to have a single page application to be used based on React that consumes this API and provides me all the operations here. So what we need, let's close this tab, let's close this tab. In fact, for the department's API controller, we are going to have a couple of modifications. The first is within the put department method, where I'm going to explicitly put an attribute before this department type parameter, where I say the data for this department object needs to be bound from the HTML form. So I say from form because the default is going to be from body and our React app is going to put it into a form. Right, so that's why I'm modifying this to from form. And the same thing I need to do in post as well. Here we go and put from form. So multi-part form data basically is going to be submitted, and that's what needs to be bound to this object. Hence this modification. Save this and let's close this. Next, the React stuff. So here we go to Solution Explorer, expand client tab, expand SRC folder into it, expands component folder into it. There is a file named as fetchdata.js. Let's open that. I'm not going to modify this, but just to have a look at what all things are required. So here you can see it's a mix of some JavaScript and some HTML stuff into it that actually is generating the UI at the client side, right? Some JavaScript methods, then some HTML dynamically getting generated by this JavaScript, and that makes our UI for weather forecast. And for the navigation system, we have navmenu.js, where you can see there are multiple nav items configured as an ordered list. Under nav items, we have nav link, where we are giving target where to go and the title to be displayed. So this is for home, this is for counter, this is for fetch data. These are all configured as routes in the client side router mentioned in app.js file. You can see slash is mapped to a component home, slash counter is mapped to a component as counter, and fetch data is mapped to a component called as fetch data, where home, fetch data, and counter are all being imported from their respective files only. Dot components slash home, and that means dot components means this, slash home means this file, slash fetch data means this file, slash counter means this file. So not file actually, their contents is what we are interested in. So if I open counter, there will be a JavaScript class, exported class named as counter that extends component, right? So that is some basic that we need to understand. I'll keep this app.js and navmenu.js open. And then the next thing that I'm going to do here is right click this components folder and say add new item. Let's expand this Asp Net Core web, select scripts, and I'll select JavaScript file. I'll name this as fetch departments. Okay. And then here now I need to connect this file to load some React components. So just like using statements in C#, we have import statements here. I'll say import React component from React. This is basically the source, and by what name the components and which components needs to be loaded, we are giving over here. So import React means load all the components from here, and then there is one component that also needs to be loaded by the name component, where I can use this name directly. Instead of saying react.component, I will be able to use component directly. This is going to be like namespace, whereas this is going to be like direct resource. I need one more import statement here. I'm going to import a component named as link from another React library, that is React -router DOM based React router I'm importing. And this link, I'm going to generate those links once again, just like what we have in nav menu. You can see link is here, and this is what we are using here to create the hyperlinks. In this view also, I'm going to need some links to be generated, hence this object has been imported. Then I create a component class. I have to use export, otherwise it won't be accessible across application components. And I'm going to need this for the routing purpose in some other places, like precisely in nav menu and app.js. So I have to have export here. This is an attribute actually. We'll name this as fetch departments, extends, that is inherits the base class called as component, and this is how the JavaScript code is written. Next thing I do here is I create the constructor for this class. In JavaScript, the constructor is created by using the keyword constructor, and then what parameters you have for it, you define here. So let's say I'm having a parameter named as props. I want this constructor to be changed to the base class constructor. So that is referred as super here in JavaScript. And I pass props object there. Props is going to be important because if I want to deal with the history object or any JavaScript DOM object, this props is going to help me with that. And then I say this dot state, that is basically where the data that is going to be bound to this UI or UI represented by this class is basically represented by state. So I say this dot state is a JSON object that contains departments as the parameter, and which is actually an array, JavaScript array. And there is another state property that I want to set, loading to true, because now shortly hereafter I am going to give the call to my web API where I'm returning all departments. So the moment that API is called, my status needs to be displayed as loading. Once the call is finished, the data binding has to happen and the loading value becomes false. Okay, so that's my constructor. Next thing I implement here is an overridden version of a method from the base class called as component did mount. This method is automatically invoked behind the scenes once the component is completely loaded. So constructor has also executed by that time. After that, this method is called. This is basically just to make sure that nothing goes wrong, because sometimes your subsequent logic may depend on the component to be loaded fully into the memory and fully initialized. So that's where we use this. Sorry, this should be the part of the class itself. Put it here. And then I have just one statement going into this, which calls a helper method, let's say named as populate departments data. Okay, this I said is a helper method, which we haven't created yet. So for that, I'll go further and create the method by this name, populate data, which is going to do some asynchronous operations in the backend. So hence I define this as async. Just like in C# we have async await. Even JavaScript also gives us that based on ECMAScript 6, on which current React implementation is based. Okay, so what I have here is a constant defined by the name response that is equals to the call made by the fetch command, which is a typical JavaScript command that communicates with the web API behind scenes. So I need to give the URI over here. So my URI is API/departments API, and this needs to be asynchronously called. So I go for await fetch, and then I say read the data from that response. So I say constant data is equals to await response.json. Whatever response is there as JSON, I'll read and assign to this object data. That actually represents the IEnumerable of department. That's what our first API method returning, and which is then represented as JavaScript array in JSON. Okay, so I can straight away say this dot set state to the JSON object that has got departments property into it, which is assigned to the data that we have retrieved, comma, as the loading has finished, I want to say loading colon false. I have another method over here that needs to be overridden from the base class component render, which is also automatically called behind scenes. Render is where our entry point lies. And here I say define a variable named as contents that is set to this dot state dot loading. Based on the value of loading, whether it is true or false, I want to return some content. So when it is loading, I just want to display the text loading as a paragraph. Otherwise, I want to show the entire data that has been retrieved from the API. So I use a ternary operator here and say the true part, if it is still loading, displays me a paragraph within that. I have bold text displayed. So the HTML5 specification says for bold, instead of B, use M, that is embossed, emphasized. I'll say loading. This gets displayed. If the state is loading, then comes the else part. And write it in more readable format. So I put question mark on the next line, followed by a space, followed by this HTML. Then here I put colon, that is the false part, where I say this dot, I call another helper method that is render departments table, not yet created, we'll be creating it shortly. And what I need to pass to this method is the data that has been downloaded. So I'll say this dot state dot departments. Okay, and then this render method needs to return something. So here I say return. What it needs to return is some HTML. Here I say there is a div slash div. In between div, I have another element that is h1 with ID equals to table label slash h1. In between, I have the title to be displayed. Let's say departments. I have a paragraph, so p slash p. Within paragraph, I have some text. This component, this is just for our understanding, fetches departments data from the server, followed by another paragraph, which is going to be important for us, that creates a link for another view that allows me to take in new department entry. So here we go and use that link object. So link to some route that is / add departments, add department, followed by / link, and in between I'll have create new department as the text. And then this content is basically I want to render here after this paragraph. So I just put curly brace contents. So whatever has been set by this ternary operator will be displayed here. So what's pending here is this method render departments table. That's the next thing I'm going to write over here. Render departments table. Here, if we see where it is getting called, we see we are passing some object to it, which I want to receive over here by the name departments. There goes the method body. And straight away, we have a return method over here, within which what I do is some UI generation for the department's data that actually gets represented as a HTML table. So I just say table, class name, some bootstrap class I want to use to make it look nice. I say table striped, and for backward compatibility for older browsers I say aria labeled by equals to table label. And /table. Of course, the table body needs to be generated here. So I have table header section, which has got the first row representing the table header row. So tr/tr. In between, I have few table headers tag. So let's say th. First one, I want it to be completely empty. I want total 4 table headers. Say 5 table headers, in fact. One I'll keep empty. Second one has got department number as the header. Third one has got name. Fourth one has got location. Fifth one I keep it empty. And then after T head, I start with T body. /T body. Now here I want the iteration over whatever data I've got into this departments. I know it's a collection, so I want to iterate. And that's where I want some React expressions to do the mapping for me. And that's why I put this curly braces, handlebars. And there I say departments dot map. Where I pass the parameter department that goes in. Again, lambda expression comes in here. And I push this to the next line. This is just like for each loop that we have in C#. That's what map is going to do. Now for each row, I'm looking to generate a table. So here I say tr/tr, and I want the key. I mean, every row that is generated should have a key identifier for it that is represented by the current department's department number. For searches later on, or for applying filters later on, this will be useful. Right, so I obtain a key, I create a td/td, the cell. First one I'll keep empty, then I have 4 more, just like th. The first td is empty, the second is going to show me department number from the current department object. So I say within handlebars department.department number. Third one I'll say is displaying department.dname. Fourth one is displaying department.location. And the fifth one is where I'm going to generate some buttons for edit and delete operation. So here I say there is a button for which there is class, bootstrap class that is going to be used, btn and btn success. Button filled with green background will be generated. Slash button. And just after the button, I want a non-breaking space as well. So I put ampersand and BSP semicolon. Button should display me the text as edit. And on click of this button, I want to do something. So here, that handler is also a JSON object where I'm going to use lambda expression in fact. So that allows me to have some JavaScript into it. So I say the handler takes in a parameter that is ID that goes in. This dot handle edit department number. Right, so I'm expecting another helper method to be created here, that is handle edit. And that takes in a parameter department number as ID and processes it further. Right, copy and paste this statement once, where again I'm going to have a button with a different CSS class, though this time I'll say btn danger. So this will be green, this will be red button. Then on click ID, this dot handle delete is the another helper method that I'm looking for. That also takes in department.department number, and the title is delete. Right, almost done. Just the matter of writing these two methods now, handle edit and handle delete. So first I'll implement handle edit. Here directly in the class, I say handle edit. It takes an ID and then says this dot props dot history object I'm looking to use dot push. I want to push the history entry, which is actually equivalent to response.redirect. want to push it to a route, React route, that is departments slash edit slash concatenated to the ID value. So that is what edit is going to do. And there will be a route handler for this that will be created separately. Okay, next is handle delete method. Let me put handle delete here. That also takes in ID as parameter. Here I put an if statement. Here I say if not, window.confirm. This is JavaScript function that gives a pop-up asking a question to the user for input. So I'm looking for confirmation. Do you want to delete department with department number and concatenated to ID? If user says yes, it should be deleted. If not, in that case, I just want to return because I put not operator there. So first condition is basically where I'll say ignore, just return else. This is where the further logic is going to come. What I want is if user wants to delete, I want my delete API to be called here. So once again, I make use of fetch API, which is going to be same once again, API slash departments API plus, in fact, there will be a slash here plus ID. That will be the complete URL, as delete is taking in a parameter from route, comma, within curly brace, I need to say the request method is supposed to be set to delete. Default is post. I want a delete request to be created. Hence, I want this to be explicitly configured. Once it is successful, I say dot then. That is based on the JavaScript promises that confirms that there is a response always, whether there is successful call or failure, the response is guaranteed here. So that's what promises basically mean. So dot then represents the implementation based on promise. So I say data goes in, again lambda expression I'm going to use here. Where I say this dot set state data colon this dot state dot departments dot filter. The currently loaded UI also needs to remove the information, right? So I say filter rec goes in, return rec dot department number is not equal to ID. So behind scenes within database, it will remove. From UI also, I need to get it removed. That's why we need this. It filters the data and binds it back. Data binding happening automatically, so I just need to set up the filters correctly here. The component is ready here. To make this work, we need to do something. First of all, in app.js, I need to create a route entry. For that, I need to import my component. So here I say import, then curly brace. I'm looking for fetch departments to be imported by the name fetch departments from dot components slash fetch departments. Okay. Next, here create a new route. So let's say route equals fetch departments component equals that component that we have imported on the top, that is fetch departments here, and finish. Then we go to navmenu.js and there we create a menu item. So I just copy and paste this nav item, the last one. Here. And here I am looking for the route mapping to fetch departments that we just defined here in app.js. This is the one. And I change the title to fetch departments. Let's say save. And let's say Control F5. So yes, it shows me loading. Create new department link also is there. That is mapped to a specific route. You can see in the bottom left corner of the browser. It's linked to base address / add department. Right now it won't go anywhere because the view or the component handler is not yet created. But we see the nice UI coming up over here. If I click this, it won't do anything as the component is missing. If I click this, the component is missing. It's not doing anything. But if I say delete, it will work. Let's say delete. Asking for confirmation, I say okay. Yeah, the further mapping I feel is again where I've made some typo mistake or something. Record was supposed to be deleted. Let's refresh this once again. Error, it's not throwing. So possibly the record is deleted already. Yes, it is deleted. It just didn't refresh on its own. Right, so nothing wrong. So I'll just minimize the browser. This time I'm not closing it and switch to the Visual Studio. And now we need to create another component named as add department, which will handle both edit and add operations. Okay, so here we go and right click components in Solution Explorer and say add new item. Once again, Asp Net Core, web, scripts and JavaScript file I'll choose. Name this as add department. So how it looks, it also starts with the similar stuff what we used earlier. Import statement that imports React component and the component itself from React. Here I create a model class on the client side. So I say export class department, which has got a constructor to set the properties. Default constructor only, and this creates the properties by using this dot department number set to 0. If you use TypeScript here, in that case you will be able to use data types as well. Dname, empty string, location equals to empty string as well. And that's my model class. And then the actual component I create here. So I say export class add department that extends component, just like what we did for fetch departments. Extends means inherits. And there again we have a constructor that takes in props as parameter, straight away passes the props to base class constructor. So we say props. Then I say this dot state equals some JSON object which has got the first property named as title. Initially the value is empty. There is another property named as department, which is set to new instance of department, where the department is this class that we have defined, comma, there is another property loading, which is set to true, as now there will be some AJAX calls. Here I make a call to a helper method that is initialize. Shortly we'll be writing this, and then some event handling binding also needs to be given. So here I say this dot handle save is equal to this dot handle save dot bind this. If I don't do this, the current object is not going to be passed to the event handler of this department class, right? So that's why this binding is needed. And same way I'll say there is another method, handle cancel, where I say this dot handle cancel dot bind, and I pass the current instance there as well. Current instance means the context need not be lost, right? So that's why we are doing this binding. Now let's implement initialize method. I make that async. The async initialize. There goes the method body, wherein I say define a variable named as department number, which is equal to this dot props dot match dot params department number, the route parameter which is going to come in. I want to read that. As you know, for edit operation we have pushed the data to the route, and that's what we are looking to retrieve back. Here I check if department number is greater than 0. That means there is a value and that value is greater than 0, which means I want this component to load the edit view. If this is 0 or less than 0, in that case I want the view to be loaded as create new department view or add view. Okay, so here goes the edit handling. I define a constant response that is mapped to await fetch. Once again, AJAX call coming in, wherein I say fetch, same API path I'll give API slash departments API slash plus department number that we have retrieved in the variable. Response comes, then I say constant data is equals to await response dot JSON. Not a new thing, we have seen that in the previous component. So here we are going to call the get API with parameter that returns me the single department object if available. If not, returns me not found. There I say this dot set state. What state we have configured here? Title, department, and loading, 3 properties. So I just say title colon edit. Same view we will be reusing, hence this logic. Department colon data, comma, loading becomes false. Else, create view needs to be loaded. So simply I say this dot state is equal to is an object where I have title set to create, comma, department set to new department, and loading set to false. Okay, so that's this initialize method. Next, this is not enough because the rendering part is not yet handled. So here we go and override the method render. So here goes render method with body as let contents equals to. This is also the same thing what we have used in the previous component. So I say this dot state dot loading. If it is true or false, based on that, I want actions taken. So I use ternary operator once again. I have p/p in between. I have emphasize tag with slash emphasize and the text going in as loading. If loading is true, then text loading gets displayed. Else, what I want to display is the result of the method this dot render create form. Helper method that is not yet created, we will be creating it shortly. For that, here we need to return something. So we say it returns div slash div equal. And what HTML goes inside this is h1 slash h1, where it shows me this dot state dot title, create or edit, whatever, based on the context. Next, I have h3 slash h3. Within this, I just display the title as department. And finally, I want an horizontal rule and there I want to display the contents that have been set by the ternary operator. Not very different from what we did in the previous component. Oh yeah, so this mistake I made again. This needs to be the part of the class, so here it should go here. Now we need to have some methods representing this handle save and handle cancel, right? That's pending as of now. And also this method create form is needed. One by one we will do that. First I'll go for handle save. So here I put handle save method that takes in a parameter named as event because it's going to be used as event handler. I say event dot prevent default. The default JavaScript behavior is whenever submit button is clicked or automatically tries submitting that to the backend service, which I don't want. So I say prevent default. I say constant data is equals to new form data, that is multi-part form data, and which is actually there in event dot target. Next, here I handle the edit operation first. So I say if this dot state dot department number will return true if there is value other than 0 and positive value. If it is 0 or negative value, it will return false. I just put this as a Boolean expression. Then I say var response 1 is equal to fetch API slash departments API slash plus this dot state dot department dot department number. Comma. That's URL, and then I need to give method. Like for delete, we put delete. Here I'll say method is put comma. First body needs to be set, so I say body is equals to the data, the form data that we have. And for this reason, we have used that from form in the backend API. This dot props dot history dot push. I want to redirect back to fetch departments. So I say slash fetch hyphen departments. That's the route we have configured. Else, we need to handle the create request also, post request basically. So here we go and say var response to is equal to fetch same API once again. I'll say API slash departments API. No parameter this time. So directly I say comma method, then post this time, comma body colon data. And again, I want to redirect if successful to fetch department. So that table view by default will be loaded. Okay, so that's our handle save. Next, I want to handle cancel. So here goes handle cancel. This also takes in event. Again, this also says event dot prevent default, and this simply redirects back to fetch departments view. And then finally we write this method render create form. So it goes here, no parameters, and there is method body. This has to return some HTML, which is actually going to refer the form or the view. So I say return what it needs to return is a form element slash form. Then form, I'll say on submit event is handled, and that is bound to this dot handle save. Now some HTML stuff that creates the form. So div slash div. This div has got some class name that is equals to form group. And represented as row. And then I have input element, type as hidden, name as department number, and value is bound to this dot state dot department dot department number. And let's finish this tag. I have another div. I just copy and paste this, as div configuration is going to be same. The first element here I have as label. Class name as control label. With call md12. That's all bootstrap stuff. HTML4 is the next attribute. I'm creating this for dname slash label. The text to be displayed as dname or just name. Next element that I have here is, I'll get rid of this input. I'll just cut this. Here I have another div slash div. This div also has got some class name. That is call md4. and there I have the input type, though this time this input type is text, name is dname. I have value placed by default value. Set to this dot state dot department dot dname. There is a class for this control as well, so I say class name, form control, we created one for location, and then we create another div. We'll copy this one and remove this input type. Row I don't want this time. And here I'm going to have a couple of buttons. So I just say button type equals to submit. Class name equals to btn success. Save / button. Then I have another button. This button class name equals to btn danger. On click, I want to bind that handle cancel event handler. So this dot handle cancel and / button. So done. Once again, we need some changes here. This time not in nav menu, but only in app.js. We need some routes to be created that we are using, and we need some components also. So here we go and say imports. Add department is the component from dot / components / add department. And then couple of routes I would be creating here. Just copy and paste the last route twice. And here I make changes. So the first one is going to be add department. And the last one is going to be departments / edit / department number. So that mapping of the ID with department number will automatically be taken. And here the component is going to be add department in both of these cases. Save, and let's come back over here. It's already refreshing. I'll click on create new department. I want to add the sales department. I want to set location as Pune. Save. I'll just refresh this. It's added. Somehow that refresh is not happening automatically. I need to check that. Though our code is completely okay, I might have missed something, but yeah, this is what it is. And then I want to add one more department here, say marketing. Location is Mumbai. I will say save. This time it automatically modified. So done. And then here I want to delete the last one. So I just click on delete. Okay. And refresh. So it's deleted. So that's done. The complete CRUD operation we have. One modification in the production level application you might want, a couple of modifications you might want is right now, if you look at our API, it is directly talking to DAL. Instead of this, what you can have is your API talks to some business layer component. Business layer talks to some repository. Repository talks to the company DB context, and then the operations are carried out. So those are standard practices anyways. This is basically where I had a very simple implementation. That's why I don't have any business logic in place, and hence I don't have any repository also in place.